This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 403 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I write a bold predictions article on NumberFire each year, and I almost feel like it's a more actionable article than the players to target or the players to avoid articles that I do too. And I think it's because typically when I'm looking at players to target or avoid, I'm looking at the most likely outcome for those players. Generally speaking. Obviously, it's different for late round guys, but players to target and avoid articles are less about boldness. With the bold predictions article, I'm thinking a little bit more abstractly. But I think when I do that, I uncover players that I'm into more than I expected. And that helps me and you draft those players. Regardless, the bold predictions article is a super fun one that I do each and every year. Last year's version hit at a very unsustainable rate, so I don't expect things to go as well this year. But I decided to take 10 of the 15 predictions that I wrote up and talk about them on today's show. You can look up the other 5 with a quick Google search of my last name and bold predictions. But since you're a loyal listener to this podcast, I'll also provide an additional bold prediction that didn't make it to the article. Now, before getting into those predictions, as you guys know, the NBA playoffs are here. And of course, FanDuel has you covered. Compete in the Mountain Dew NBA Free Play from now through September 4th for your chance to win your seat in a virtual event with NBA legends Gary Payton and Ray Allen. With each entry, you'll also be entered in the King of the Mountain Dew 3-point bonus for your chance to win a share of $15,000. Brought to you by Mountain Dew, official sponsor of the NBA. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. So the first bold prediction I want to talk about is that Terry McLaurin will score more fantasy points than Amari Cooper. Now this is a bold prediction because McLaurin is currently being selected about 12 to 15 wide receiver spots below Amari Cooper. That's according to Best Ball 10's ADP. Now I don't think that there's anything really wrong with Amari Cooper's ADP. But I do think there is more volatility than people realize. The Cowboys took CeeDee Lamb in the first round of April's draft. That gives the offense another legitimate mouth to feed, and that has a chance to lower Amari Cooper's overall target share, or at least cap it. But Amari Cooper was actually pretty fortunate in the touchdown column last year. You might not realize it because he only scored 8 times. But ESPN Mike Clay's opportunity adjusted touchdown metric, or OTD, showed that he should have had a little under 5. He was one of the top 20 biggest overachievers in touchdowns last year. And it was all because he had unsustainable play in the red zone. So you look at that, you look at some inconsistent play historically from Amari Cooper, and then you add CeeDee Lamb into the mix. It's sort of easy to see Amari Cooper not totally living up to expectation. I don't mind him, but I'm not targeting him heavily. With Terry McLaurin, there's obviously some fear that the Washington football team is going to be very bad offensively. But he has a lot of potential. He only saw 93 targets despite a 20% target share last year, and that's all because Washington ran the second fewest plays that any offense has run since 2011. At the same pass-to-rush ratio that they had last year, with an average number of plays, McLaurin would have easily had 100 to 110 targets. And again, he's a rookie. And Washington didn't do a whole lot to bring in competition for Terry McLaurin. So him getting to a 25%, a 26% target share is very viable. Volume wins in fantasy football. I understand the situation might suck, but it also might be more average than just terrible. And that's why Terry McLaurin has a chance to outscore Amari Cooper. The second bold prediction is that Cam Newton will finish as a top 5 quarterback. Now this is obviously bold because Newton is usually drafted outside the top 10 or 12 quarterbacks. I don't think this one's that hard to imagine though. There's a lot of question marks because Newton's in this new environment. There's going to be some sort of learning curve. But when he's healthy, he's a monster in fantasy football. And right now, he appears to be healthy. Cam Newton has finished 8 NFL seasons with 14 or more games played. He's ended up as a top 4 fantasy quarterback in 5 of those seasons. Now, you might sit back and say New England doesn't have very good weapons. Cam Newton didn't have very good weapons in Carolina either. And let's not forget, the last time we saw a healthy Cam Newton back in 2018, he was dominating in fantasy football. He was a stud. Before injuring his shoulder in Week 10 against Pittsburgh in 2018, he had averaged 23.7 fantasy points per game. He was the QB4 in fantasy football. I think he's probably the go-to late round quarterback this year. The third bold prediction is that Jerick McKinnon will catch at least 15 more passes than Mark Ingram. Now, this is bold because Jerick McKinnon is kind of an afterthought in fantasy drafts for the most part. He hasn't played in forever. Now, I understand that Mark Ingram is not that much of a pass catcher. Even though he finished as a top 10 running back last year, he only had 26 receptions. And it's because Baltimore is a run-heavy team. But now you add in J.K. Dobbins, who could steal some of those looks, and Mark Ingram might not reach that 6 to 7% target share again. It's a little bit scary in that offense. But with Jerick McKinnon, he has a pass-catching skill set. Now, he hasn't played since 2017, but in his 4 active seasons with the Vikings, he had 27, 21, 43, and 51 receptions. Raheem Mostert last season averaged a target share per game under 7% when he started seeing significant snaps. But at the same time, the 49ers still ranked 14th in the league in running back target share. They were still targeting their running backs. What if McKinnon is that piece that they need out of the backfield? I think that he can push the 40 reception mark this year. The next bold prediction is that Adam Thielen will finish as a top 3 fantasy wide receiver. Now, this one's bold because Adam Thielen is being drafted outside the top 12 right now. But I think Adam Thielen is one of the few wide receivers in this league this year that can hit the 150 target mark. Since 2011, of the 27 wide receivers with a top 3 season-long finish, 23 of them saw at least 150 targets. Last season, you got to kind of push aside because Adam Thielen wasn't totally healthy. But Minnesota was also good last year, running just 36.6% of their offensive plays while trailing. They had a lot of positive game scripts. That led to a lot of rushing for that offense. But now Stephon Diggs is not on this team. And we could see more negative game scripts because the Vikings have an over-under win total of 8.5 on FanDuel Sportsbook. There aren't many options in this offense. Adam Thielen might be fed, and with a little touchdown variance, he could end up with a really, really solid fantasy season. James Conner will score more points than Nick Chubb. This one is bold because everyone's drafting Nick Chubb way ahead of James Conner. But I think that this could happen. The biggest knock on James Conner is his durability. He's yet to play a full season during his 3-year NFL career. But we've seen his upside in a totally normal environment. And by totally normal environment, I mean one where he's the starter or Ben Roethlisberger is healthy. Back in 2018, James Conner averaged 21.5 points per game in the 13 games that he played. That's a number that's 5.6 points higher than Nick Chubb's single season points per game high. So this is far from impossible of happening. And what happens if Nick Chubb's workload is dinged a little bit more than we expect with Kareem Hunt now in the mix across the entire season? I've talked about this before on the show, but it's going to be tough for things to get better for Nick Chubb in terms of rushing share. In 2019, he had almost 76% of Cleveland's rushes. That's the 3rd highest individual rushing share that we've seen since 2011. That's not going to be repeated. And then as we know, Kareem Hunt is a great pass catcher. He's going to cap Nick Chubb's ceiling as a pass catcher as he did last year when he returned. I don't mind Nick Chubb where he's being drafted. It's fine. But I definitely see a scenario where James Conner, if he's healthy, outscores Chubb. The next bold prediction is that Calvin Ridley and Julio Jones will both finish as a top 12 wide receiver. I think this is the least bold of all of them that I'm going to talk about today. But the reason it's somewhat bold is because these are 2 wide receivers on the same team, both finishing as top 12 wideouts. But as I talked about last year with Mike Evans and Chris Godwin on the same exact show, teammates finishing as top 12 wide receivers as wide receiver ones happens pretty frequently. We had the Buccaneers do it last year. We had 2 pairings do it in 2018, 1 in 2017, 2 in 2016, none in 2015, but then 2 in 2014, 2013, and 2012. We've been averaging more than 1 wide receiver teammate pairing finishing as wide receiver ones together per season. And the obvious pick this year is Julio Jones and Calvin Ridley. I think you can make the case for other sets of wide receivers like Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf, maybe even Juju Smith-Schuster and Deontay Johnson. That would have been bolder. But I love Calvin Ridley. That's what this is all about, really. In the 4 seasons that Dirk Cutter has been offensive coordinator for Atlanta, they've been in the top 8 in pass attempts every single season. With a really shallow target tree there, Calvin Ridley and Julio Jones should eat. The next bold prediction is that Bryce Love will outscore both Kerryon Johnson and Marlon Mack. Now, this is bold because Kerryon Johnson and Marlon Mack are going off draft boards multiple rounds before Bryce Love. I'm not really that into drafting Marlon Mack or Kerryon Johnson this year. I just don't see a path to upside. But I think there is a path to upside for Bryce Love. Without an injury, of course. I'm not talking about injuries here. I like Antonio Gibson the most in that backfield. He's that Swiss Army knife who can catch the ball out of the backfield and do a lot for that offense. But don't forget about Bryce Love. He wasn't a bad prospect at all. And all he needs to do is beat out Antonio Gibson, who only had 77 touches in college, and a geriatric 35-year-old Adrian Peterson. It's not that hard to see Bryce Love elevating himself to the RB1 in that Washington offense. And like I said, I don't like Johnson and Mack this year. You have DeAndre Swift, who's going to steal a lot of looks from Kerryon Johnson, and you have Jonathan Taylor, who I think could just take over that backfield. I think projection-wise, Kerryon Johnson and Marlon Mack should project to score more points than Bryce Love. But absolutely, I think that Bryce Love has a higher ceiling. Tyler Lockett will finish as a top 8 wide receiver. Now, this one's bold because most fantasy managers are taking Tyler Lockett outside the top 20 wide receivers. As the offseason has gone on, I've liked Tyler Lockett more and more. There's a couple reasons for it. First off, Tyler Lockett balled out last season before he got hurt. He had that leg injury that slowed him down towards the end of last year, but prior to that injury, he was averaging about 19 PPR points per game. After the injury, that number dropped to 9.2. He was essentially the wide receiver 3 in fantasy football before that injury happened. Now, the reason that his ADP is where it's at is because Seattle is projected to be a run-heavy team. But like I said in the mailbag show last week, what if they let Russell Wilson cook? What if they air it out just a little bit more? There's a path to serious upside for both Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. And as we know in that offense, both of those wide receivers are going to have fairly high average at the targets, and they're going to be targeted in the end zone a lot. Last season, DK Metcalf led the NFL in wide receiver end zone targets. Tyler Lockett was 4th. So if Tyler Lockett's able to maintain his 22.4% target share, he should be able to exceed his draft day expectation. But if that Seahawks offense gets a little bit more pass heavy, I could see him finishing as a top 8 wide receiver. This next one is that Jamison Crowder will score more points than Stephon Diggs. This one's bold because you're typically going to find Jamison Crowder getting selected 15 or more wide receiver spots after Stephon Diggs. But as I talked about in the Players to Avoid episode, I'm a little bit worried about Stephon Diggs this year in fantasy football. The Bills probably won't be throwing the ball all that much this year. They've averaged 506 pass attempts over the last 2 seasons. The wide receiver 12, the last of the wide receiver 1s over the last 5 seasons, has averaged 15.9 PPR points per game. Now, since 2011, 30.2% of teams have thrown the ball 525 or fewer times in a single season. Again, the Bills have averaged 506 pass attempts per season over the last 2 years. Only 11.5% of wide receiver seasons where a wideout hit that 15.9 mark came from those low-volume teams. And then you add in the fact that Stephon Diggs is playing with a new quarterback. The ramp-up period isn't very favorable. I just have a hard time drafting Stephon Diggs this year, even though he's an awesome talent. But meanwhile, Jamison Crowder is in a position to just see a lot of volume in that offense. According to FanDuel Sportsbook, the Jets are projected to win 2 fewer games than the Bills. They're likely going to be more pass-heavy. And Jamison Crowder is not fighting with a lot of talent to see that volume. It's really just Brashad Perriman and Chris Herndon right now. He already had a near 25% target share last season. Jamison Crowder had 122 targets last year. That's a number that should look pretty similar to 2020. To me, it's not that hard to see Jamison Crowder outscore Stephon Diggs this year. This next one's a fun one, and it's the last one from my article, but it's that Logan Thomas will be the surprise tight end this year. Now, this is bold because no one is even drafting Logan Thomas. There's a lot of ambiguity within that Washington offense. That's why you see 3 different bold predictions within that offense on today's episode. I already talked about Terry McLaurin, I talked about Bryce Love, and now I'm talking about Logan Thomas. But who's Washington's number 2 wide receiver? Who's their top tight end? That's the point. Logan Thomas has an opportunity. He's a converted quarterback with insane athletic measurables. And he's only been playing tight end for a few years. Like I talked about earlier this offseason, one of the keys in spotting breakout tight ends is that they're typically very, very athletic. more so than what you see from running backs and wide receivers, easily. And Logan Thomas has that. And he's walking into a position where he actually could see volume. There's a much better chance that Logan Thomas does nothing this year as opposed to being a very, very productive tight end in fantasy football. But this is a bold predictions podcast. I got to be bold. And Logan Thomas, to me, is going to be the surprise tight end this year. So all the predictions that I've walked through so far were written up in my article. Again, you can go search for that and find it, or just check my Twitter timeline at LateRoundQB. An additional bold prediction that I want to talk about today is that Zach Moss will outscore his teammate Devin Singletary. I've talked a bit about the dynamic between Moss and Singletary on this show in the past, and how I've targeted Moss at his ADP way more than Singletary at his. Earlier this offseason, back in January, I thought that Singletary was a buy candidate for dynasty purposes. I've clearly cold on that as time has gone by. My biggest fear for Singletary is that he's not going to see any of the highly important looks in fantasy football. At one point, the thought was that he was going to be the primary pass catcher in that offense, with Zach Moss being the early down or an early down player and the goal line guy, the bigger bodied guy. But number one, Moss is more than capable as a pass catcher. He actually had a better receiving profile coming out of college than Devin Singletary did. That was a big knock that I had on Singletary coming out. One of the biggest surprises for me last year was how Singletary was utilized in that offense as a receiver. And then number two, Moss has already gotten praise for that pass catching skill set according to reports. I'm just worried about Devin Singletary. I ranted about this on a mailbag show about a month or so ago, but he just comes across as someone who's going to be more of a between the 20s type player. And with Moss in the mix, Singletary is going to have capped upside as a rusher, touchdown scorer, and potentially receiver. Moss is probably going to see his ADP rise over the next week or two because of these positive reports that are coming out of Buffalo. But I think it's totally justified. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.